I stood in my driveway staring at the certified letter in my hand, reading it for the third time to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. The Madison Heights Homeowners Association was demanding that I remove the spray foam insulation I had installed in my attic within 30 days, or face daily fines of $500. This had to be some kind of joke. My name is Yates Lawson, and I had just moved to this neighborhood in Spokane, Washington, 6 months ago. The house was a beautiful 1980s ranch-style home with a mountain view, but it had one major problem that became immediately apparent during my first winter here. The pipes in the attic kept threatening to freeze, and my heating bills were astronomical. The previous owner had apparently just dealt with it, but I wasn't about to throw money away or risk a burst pipe disaster. I had done everything by the book. I got the proper permits from the city, hired a licensed contractor, and had the work inspected and approved. The spray foam insulation was a professional job that cost me nearly $8,000, but it immediately solved my freezing pipe problem and cut my heating bill in half. Everything was legal, safe, and logical. Or so I thought. The letter was signed by Patricia Henderson, the HOA president, and it cited some obscure covenant about unauthorized structural modifications. I read through the specific section they referenced, and it was so vaguely worded that it could mean almost anything. According to their interpretation, adding insulation to my attic constituted a structural modification that required HOA approval before the work began. I hadn't even known I needed HOA approval. The city permit office never mentioned it, and the contractor never brought it up either. I pulled out my copy of the HOA bylaws that I had received when I bought the house and started reading through them more carefully. The more I read, the more frustrated I became. The rules were a maze of contradictions and unclear language that seemed designed to trap homeowners. The next morning, I called the number listed on the letter and got Patricia's voicemail. Her outgoing message was clipped and formal, instructing me to leave a detailed message and she would return my call within 2 business days. 2 business days. For something this urgent. I left a message anyway, explaining that the insulation was properly permitted and inspected by the city, and that removing it would create a serious safety hazard. 3 days passed with no callback. Meanwhile, I did some research on Patricia Henderson and the HOA board. What I found was disturbing. The Madison Heights HOA had a reputation in the community for being overly aggressive and nitpicky. Online forums were filled with complaints from current and former residents about arbitrary rule enforcement, excessive fines, and a general attitude of hostility toward homeowners. Patricia herself was a 52-year-old woman who had lived in the neighborhood for nearly 20 years. She had been HOA president for the last 7 years, running unopposed in every election. According to multiple accounts, she treated the position like a personal fiefdom, using the HOA rules to settle personal vendettas and maintain control over the neighborhood. Several people mentioned that she particularly seemed to target new residents who didn't immediately fall in line with her expectations. I decided to go directly to her house to discuss this face-to-face. She lived 4 streets over in a 2-story colonial that looked like something out of a magazine. Every blade of grass was perfectly trimmed, every shrub was precisely shaped, and there wasn't a single leaf or twig anywhere on the property. It was almost unsettling how perfect it looked. I rang the doorbell and waited. After a moment, Patricia opened the door. She was a thin woman with shoulder-length blonde hair that was clearly dyed, wearing a white blouse and black slacks that looked too formal for a Saturday afternoon at home. Her expression was cold and unwelcoming from the moment she saw me. "Can I help you?" she asked, even though I could tell she knew exactly who I was. "Hi, I'm Yates Lawson from Oak Ridge Drive. I got your letter about the insulation and I was hoping we could discuss this." "There's nothing to discuss. You violated the HOA covenants by making structural modifications without approval. The insulation needs to be removed." But it wasn't a structural modification. It was insulation, and I had all the proper city permits and inspections. City permits are irrelevant. The HOA governs what happens in this neighborhood, and our rules clearly state that any modifications require board approval first. I pulled out my copy of the bylaws. I read the section you cited, and it talks about structural changes like adding rooms or modifying the roofline. Insulation doesn't change the structure of anything. Patricia's expression hardened. "I've been president of this HOA for 7 years, Mr. Lawson. I know our rules better than you do. The board has reviewed your case and made our decision. Remove the insulation or face the fines." "This insulation is preventing my pipes from freezing. If I remove it, I'm risking serious water damage." "That sounds like a personal problem. You should have thought about that before you did unauthorized work." She started to close the door. "Wait, can I at least appeal this decision to the full board?" The full board already approved the letter. "Good day, Mr. Lawson." She shut the door in my face. I stood there for a moment, stunned by her complete unwillingness to even discuss the issue. This wasn't about rules or regulations. This was about power and control. Patricia had decided I was going to be made an example of, and she wasn't going to back down. Over the next week, I tried every avenue I could think of. I called the other board members, but none of them would return my calls. I sent a formal written appeal to the HOA, which was rejected without explanation. I even tried to gather support from my neighbors, but most of them were either too afraid of the HOA to get involved or had their own ongoing battles with Patricia. One neighbor, an older man named George who lived next door to me, was sympathetic but warned me to be careful. "Patricia has ruined people in this neighborhood," he told me over his fence one evening. "She'll find every little violation she can and bury you in fines. I've seen her force 3 families to sell their homes and move away because they couldn't afford to keep fighting her." "That can't be legal," I said. "Legal or not, she does it. And the rest of the board just goes along with whatever she wants. They're all afraid of her too." The 30-day deadline was approaching fast, and I was running out of options. That's when I decided to call the city building inspector who had approved my insulation installation. His name was Marcus Reeves, and he had seemed knowledgeable and professional when he did the inspection. Marcus remembered me and my property. "That was good work you had done there," he said. "That spray foam is top quality and it definitely solved your cold attic problem. Why do you ask?" I explained the situation with the HOA. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "They want you to remove it," Marcus finally said. "That's insane. That insulation isn't just a comfort upgrade. In Spokane winters, proper attic insulation is a safety issue. Without it, you're looking at frozen pipes, potential bursts, and in extreme cold snaps, even ice dams that can cause roof damage." "Can you put that in writing?" "Absolutely. In fact, I'm going to do better than that. I'm going to schedule a formal inspection and document why that insulation needs to stay. The HOA can't force you to create a safety hazard on your property." 2 days later, Marcus came back out to my house. He spent over an hour in the attic, taking photographs, checking the pipes, and making detailed notes. When he came back down, he looked concerned. "Yates, I need to be straight with you. If you remove this insulation, you're going to have serious problems this winter. We've got forecasts showing we might have the coldest December in 20 years. Those pipes will freeze, and when they burst, you're looking at tens of thousands in damage, maybe more if it floods while you're not home. So, what do I do? The HOA is threatening $500 daily fines starting next week. You stand your ground. I'm going to write up a formal report stating that removing this insulation creates a clear and present danger to your property and potentially to neighboring properties if a major pipe burst causes flooding. The city building code supersedes HOA rules when it comes to safety issues. Marcus was true to his word. 3 days later, I received a formal letter from the Spokane Building Inspection Department. It was detailed, technical, and unambiguous. The insulation was not only allowed but necessary for safety. Removing it would violate city building codes related to preventing freeze damage in residential properties. The letter specifically stated that any entity attempting to force the removal of necessary insulation could be held liable for damages resulting from that removal. I immediately sent a copy to Patricia and the HOA board, along with a letter stating that I would not be removing the insulation and that any fines imposed would be contested. I felt confident that this would be the end of it. I was wrong. The fines started exactly on schedule. I received a bill for $500 for the first day, then another, then another. Within a week, I was supposedly owing $3,500. I refused to pay and sent another letter citing the building inspector's report. Patricia responded with a letter stating that the HOA had consulted with their attorney and that city building codes did not override HOA covenants. The fines would continue. I consulted with my own attorney, a sharp woman in her 40s named Rebecca Chen who specialized in property law. She read through all the documentation, including the HOA bylaws, the building inspector's report, and the letters from Patricia. "This is going to get ugly," Rebecca said. "Technically, the HOA does have the right to enforce their covenants, but they don't have the right to force you to violate building codes or create safety hazards. The problem is that these battles can drag on for years and cost more in legal fees than just paying the fines. So, what do you recommend?" We file for an injunction to stop the fines while we challenge the HOA's interpretation of their own bylaws. We argue that their covenant about structural modifications doesn't apply to safety-related insulation. And we use the building inspector's report to show that their demand creates a dangerous situation. How long will that take? Months, probably. And it's going to cost you. I charge $250 an hour, and these cases typically require 40 to 60 hours of work, minimum. I did the math in my head. Even at the low end, I was looking at $10,000 in legal fees, plus whatever the HOA fines accumulated to while we fought this out. It was maddening. I had done everything right, and now I was being punished for it, but I wasn't going to back down. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the principle of the thing. Patricia Henderson was abusing her power, and someone needed to stand up to her. Rebecca filed the paperwork for the injunction the next day. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out, which meant the fines would continue to accumulate. By the time we got to court, the HOA was claiming I owed over $10,000. The hearing was held in Spokane County Superior Court before Judge William Thornton, a stern-looking man in his 60s with silver hair and reading glasses. Patricia showed up with the HOA's attorney, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit named Derek Morrison. He had the air of someone who was used to winning. Rebecca presented our case methodically. She showed the judge the city permits, the inspection reports, and most importantly, Marcus Reeves' formal letter stating that the insulation was necessary for safety. She argued that HOA covenants cannot be used to force homeowners to violate building codes or create dangerous conditions. Derek Morrison countered that HOA covenants were legally binding contracts that homeowners agreed to when they purchased their properties. He argued that I had violated those covenants by not seeking approval before the work began, and that the nature of the violation was irrelevant. Rules were rules, and allowing me to bypass them would set a precedent that would undermine the HOA's authority. Judge Thornton listened carefully to both sides, asking pointed questions of both attorneys. Then he asked to hear from Marcus Reeves directly. The building inspector had agreed to testify, and he laid out in clear, non-technical terms exactly why the insulation was critical. "Your Honor, Spokane gets cold, really cold. We're talking sustained temperatures below zero during winter cold snaps. Houses built in the 1980s, like Mr. Lawson's, often have inadequate attic insulation by modern standards. The pipes running through his attic are at serious risk without proper insulation. I've seen pipes freeze and burst in houses just like his during bad winters, causing flooding that destroys ceilings, walls, and everything below. We're talking about potential damage in the $50,000 to $100,000 range, not to mention the risk to neighboring properties if the flooding is severe enough. And in your professional opinion, is this insulation necessary?" the judge asked. "Absolutely necessary, Your Honor. It's not a luxury. It's a basic safety measure." Judge Thornton turned to Derek Morrison. "Counselor, how does your client respond to the safety concern?" "Your Honor, the HOA is not disputing that insulation may be beneficial. However, Mr. Lawson was required to seek approval before installing it. If he had done so, this entire situation could have been avoided." "Would the HOA have approved it?" the judge asked. Derek hesitated for just a moment. "That would have been up to the board to decide." "Miss Henderson," the judge said, looking directly at Patricia. "You're the HOA president. If Mr. Lawson had come to you before installing this insulation, would you have approved it?" Patricia stood up, her expression tight. "We would have reviewed the request according to our procedures." "That's not what I asked. Would you have approved it? We would have needed to ensure that the installation met our aesthetic standards and didn't create any visual impact from the street." "The insulation is in the attic, Miss Henderson. How would it create a visual impact from the street?" "Well, we would have needed to review the contractor's credentials and ensure they were properly licensed and insured." Marcus spoke up. "Your Honor, the contractor was licensed and insured. I verified that during my inspection." Judge Thornton removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked tired and annoyed. "Let me be very clear about something. I've been on the bench for 18 years and I've seen more HOA disputes than I care to count. Most of them are petty nonsense about lawn ornaments or paint colors, but this case involves a genuine safety issue." He put his glasses back on and looked at Patricia. "Miss Henderson, I'm troubled by your answers here today. You seem more concerned with asserting authority than with the safety of a homeowner's property. The court finds that the building inspector's testimony is credible and compelling. Mr. Lawson's insulation is a necessary safety measure, and forcing its removal would create an unreasonable risk of property damage." He turned to Derek. "The injunction is granted. The HOA is prohibited from imposing any fines related to this insulation. Furthermore, any fines already assessed are nullified. Mr. Lawson owes nothing." Rebecca and I both exhaled in relief, but the judge wasn't done. "However, I'm also troubled by Mr. Lawson's failure to follow the HOA's procedures. While I find that the insulation is necessary and cannot be removed, I also find that HOA covenants do have legal weight, and homeowners have a responsibility to follow proper procedures. My stomach dropped. Was he about to reverse his decision? Therefore, I'm ordering Mr. Lawson to pay a one-time administrative fee of $500 to the HOA for failure to seek prior approval. This is not a fine for having the insulation. This is a fee for not following proper procedure. Do you understand, Mr. Lawson? Yes, Your Honor, I said. Good. The HOA will accept this payment and consider the matter closed. If they attempt to impose any further fines or penalties related to this insulation, Mr. Lawson may return to this court, and I will be far less charitable to the HOA. Am I clear, Miss Henderson? Patricia's face had turned red. Yes, Your Honor. This hearing is concluded. I paid the $500 gladly. It was a fraction of what the HOA had tried to extract from me, and more importantly, I had won. The insulation stayed, and Patricia had been publicly dressed down by a judge. It felt like justice, but I should have known it wouldn't end there. Over the next month, I started receiving violation notices for increasingly petty things. My garbage cans were visible from the street for 20 minutes after trash pickup. My grass was supposedly a quarter-inch too tall. A small paint chip on my mailbox post was cited as a maintenance violation. Each notice came with a threat of fines if not corrected immediately. It was obvious what was happening. Patricia was retaliating against me for challenging her authority. She was going to make my life miserable in any way she could. I wasn't the only one who noticed. George, my neighbor, mentioned that he had seen Patricia walking around my property with a notebook, clearly looking for violations. Other neighbors started coming forward quietly, sharing their own stories of Patricia's vindictive behavior over the years. One neighbor, a single mother named Donna, told me that Patricia had once forced her to repaint her entire house because the shade of beige she used was supposedly not on the approved color list, even though it was virtually identical to the original color. Another neighbor, a retired veteran named Frank, said Patricia had fined him repeatedly for parking his truck in his own driveway because she claimed it was unsightly. I started documenting everything. Every violation notice, every photograph Patricia took of my property, every interaction we had. Rebecca advised me that if the harassment continued, we could potentially file a counter-suit against the HOA for selective enforcement and harassment. Then things escalated in a way I never expected. It was a Tuesday evening in late November. The temperature had dropped significantly, and we were expecting our first major snowfall of the season. I was inside making dinner when I heard a loud crash from outside. I ran to the front door and found Patricia standing in my driveway, next to my car, holding what looked like a small notebook. My driver's side mirror was hanging by its wires, clearly broken. Patricia looked startled to see me. "What happened?" I asked, walking quickly toward her. "Your mirror was sticking out too far into the driveway. I accidentally brushed against it." I looked at the mirror, then at Patricia, then at the amount of space between where she was standing and where my car was parked. There was no way she had accidentally brushed against anything. She would have had to deliberately strike it. "Patricia, my car was parked completely in my driveway. You had to come onto my property to get close enough to hit that mirror. I was conducting a property inspection. Without my permission, that's trespassing. The HOA has the right to inspect properties for code violations. No, you don't. Not without advance notice and not without permission, and you definitely don't have the right to damage my property." I pulled out my phone and took several photographs of the broken mirror and Patricia standing next to my car. She realized what I was doing and quickly backed away. "I'll file an incident report with the HOA about the mirror," she said. "You do that. and I'll be filing a police report for vandalism and trespassing." Her eyes widened. "You wouldn't dare. Watch me." I called the Spokane Police Department right there while Patricia stood in my driveway. She left before the officer arrived, but I had the photographs and my statement. The responding officer, a young guy named Officer Bryant, took down all the information and gave me a case number. "This is technically a civil matter since it's property damage under $1,000, he said. "But given the ongoing dispute you've described with the HOA, you might want to consider getting a restraining order if this person keeps coming onto your property." "Can I do that?" "You can apply for one. Whether you'll get it depends on whether the judge thinks there's sufficient evidence of harassment, but it might be worth looking into." I discussed it with Rebecca the next day. She thought a restraining order might be excessive at this point, but she did send a formal cease and desist letter to Patricia, demanding that she stay off my property except for legitimate HOA business with advance notice. Patricia responded through Derek Morrison, claiming that she had been within her rights as HOA president and that any damage to my mirror was accidental. They offered to pay for the repair, which I accepted, but only because it wasn't worth fighting over $200. The incidents continued throughout December. More petty violations, more threatening letters, more harassment, but Patricia was careful now. She never came onto my property again, at least not that I could prove. Instead, she seemed to be conducting surveillance from the street, photographing my house at different times of day. The stress was getting to me. I had moved to Spokane for a fresh start after a divorce, hoping to find some peace and stability. Instead, I was locked in a constant battle with a vindictive HOA president who seemed to have made destroying my life her personal mission. Then, just before Christmas, everything changed. I got a call from George, my neighbor. He sounded agitated. "Yates, you need to come over here right now. And bring your phone to record." I hurried over to his house, where I found George, Donna, Frank, and 3 other neighbors I recognized from the street gathered in his living room. Everyone looked angry and determined. "We've had enough," George said. "We've all been dealing with Patricia's abuse for years, and watching what she's done to you was the last straw. We're organizing a recall of the entire HOA board. We've been going through the bylaws, and there's a provision that allows homeowners to force a recall election if 25% of the residents sign a petition. We've already got signatures from 30% of the neighborhood." Donna spoke up. "We've also been collecting documentation of Patricia's behavior over the years. Selective enforcement, harassment, intimidating people into selling their homes. We've got emails, letters, photographs, everything. We're building a case that she's been abusing her position." "Why now?" I asked. "Why didn't anyone do this before?" Frank, the retired veteran, answered. "Because she's good at keeping people isolated. She targets one person at a time, makes them feel like they're alone, like nobody else will support them. But when you stood up to her, it inspired the rest of us. We realized we could fight back if we worked together. Over the next 2 weeks, we organized. More neighbors came forward with their stories and their documentation. We discovered that Patricia had been involved in dozens of disputes over the years, many of which had ended with homeowners paying thousands in fines or even selling their homes. In at least 3 cases, people had paid fines for violations that we couldn't find any evidence they had actually committed. We also discovered something more troubling. When we started looking at the HOA's financial records, which we had a legal right to access, we found irregularities. There were expenses that didn't make sense, payments to contractors for work that no one could remember being done, and a pattern of the HOA spending money in ways that seemed to benefit Patricia personally. One particular expense caught our attention. The HOA had paid nearly $15,000 to a landscaping company for neighborhood beautification. But when we contacted the company, they said they had only done about $5,000 worth of work for the HOA. The rest, they said, had been for work at a private residence. When we asked which residence, they gave us Patricia's address. This wasn't just abuse of power anymore. This was fraud. Rebecca advised us to bring this information to the police. We compiled all the financial records showing the discrepancies and filed a formal complaint with the Spokane Police Department's Fraud Division. This was beyond Officer Bryant's patrol duties. This required detectives. Detective Sarah Morrison, no relation to Derek Morrison, was assigned to the case. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her early 40s who specialized in white-collar crime. She reviewed our documentation and seemed genuinely concerned. "This looks like embezzlement," she said. "If your HOA president has been using association funds for personal expenses, that's a crime. I'm going to need to do a full investigation, which means I'll need access to all the HOA financial records, including bank statements and canceled checks." We told her that, as homeowners, we could request those records, but we were concerned that Patricia would destroy evidence once she knew we were investigating. "Leave that to me," Detective Morrison said. "I'll get a warrant if necessary." Things moved quickly after that. Detective Morrison contacted the HOA's bank and secured the financial records before Patricia even knew an investigation was underway. What she found was worse than we had imagined. Over the course of 7 years, Patricia had embezzled nearly $70,000 from the HOA. She had used HOA funds to pay for landscaping at her house, repairs to her roof, even a new heating system. She had been careful about it, spreading the theft out over years and hiding it among legitimate expenses. But once Detective Morrison started pulling the thread, the whole thing unraveled. Patricia was arrested on a Tuesday morning in January. I wasn't there when it happened, but George was, and he told me about it later. 2 police cars showed up at her house at 7 in the morning. Patricia answered the door in a bathrobe, and the officers informed her that she was being arrested for embezzlement and fraud. She tried to argue with them, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, but they handcuffed her and put her in the patrol car while her husband stood in the doorway looking shocked and devastated. The arrest made the local news. The headlines read, "HOA president arrested for embezzling thousands," and "Spokane HOA leader faces fraud charges." The story detailed the investigation and mentioned that multiple homeowners had been victims of Patricia's abuse of power. My phone didn't stop ringing for days. Reporters wanted interviews. Neighbors wanted to share their own stories, and even people from other HOAs in the area reached out to say they had similar problems with their boards. Derek Morrison, the HOA's attorney, resigned immediately, claiming he had been unaware of Patricia's illegal activities. The rest of the board members also resigned, stating they had been essentially rubber stamping whatever Patricia wanted and hadn't properly overseen the finances. With the board dissolved, we had to quickly organize a new election. George agreed to run for president on a platform of transparency and reasonable rule enforcement. Donna ran for treasurer, promising to implement proper financial oversight. Frank and 2 other neighbors ran for the remaining board positions. They all won by overwhelming margins. The neighborhood had finally had enough of Patricia's reign. The criminal case against Patricia moved through the legal system over the following months. She initially pleaded not guilty, but faced with the overwhelming evidence Detective Morrison had compiled, her attorney eventually negotiated a plea deal. Patricia pleaded guilty to multiple counts of embezzlement and fraud. In March, she was sentenced to 3 years in prison, with the possibility of early release after 18 months if she demonstrated good behavior. She was also ordered to pay full restitution of $70,000 to the HOA, plus additional fines and court costs. Her husband, who apparently had been unaware of what she was doing, filed for divorce shortly after the sentencing. The house they had lived in for 20 years, the one with the perfect lawn and perfect landscaping, went up for sale. I heard it sold at a significant loss because of all the publicity about Patricia's crimes. Meanwhile, under George's leadership, the HOA underwent major reforms. The bylaws were rewritten to be clearer and less prone to abuse. New financial oversight procedures were implemented, including quarterly audits by an independent accountant. And most importantly, the board adopted a policy of reasonable enforcement, focusing on actual problems rather than petty violations. My insulation issue became a case study in the new bylaws. The rules were clarified to explicitly state that safety-related work, especially work that was properly permitted and inspected by the city, did not require HOA pre-approval. Homeowners were still encouraged to inform the HOA about major work, but it was no longer a requirement for things like insulation, electrical upgrades, or plumbing repairs. The neighborhood started to feel different. People were friendlier, more willing to chat with each other, less fearful. It turned out that Patricia's reign of terror had made everyone suspicious and isolated. Without her constant surveillance and arbitrary rule enforcement, the community started to actually feel like a community. I settled into my house and finally started to enjoy living there. The insulation continued to work perfectly through the cold Spokane winters. My heating bills stayed low, and my pipes never froze. Every time I walked past my thermostat and saw the reasonable temperature reading, I thought about how close I had come to being forced to remove that protection. George turned out to be an excellent HOA president. He ran the association with common sense and compassion, understanding that people were living their lives and didn't need constant scrutiny. When actual problems came up, like a neighbor who let their lawn completely die and become a fire hazard, he handled it with communication and offers of help rather than immediate fines and threats. The financial restitution from Patricia slowly came back to the HOA. She was making payments from prison, though at the rate she was paying, it would take years to recover everything she had stolen. George and the board decided to use the recovered funds to make actual improvements to the neighborhood, things that Patricia had always claimed there wasn't money for. They repaired sidewalks, upgraded the neighborhood entrance landscaping, and even installed better street lighting. In May, over a year after the initial letter about my insulation, the neighborhood held a community barbecue in the common area. It was the first social event we had held in years. Patricia had always vetoed such gatherings, claiming they were too much work and liability for the HOA. As I stood there with a plate of food, talking with George, Donna, Frank, and other neighbors who had become real friends, I reflected on everything that had happened. It had been one of the most stressful periods of my life, but it had also taught me important lessons about standing up for what's right and the power of community. Marcus Reeves, the building inspector who had started it all by standing up for safety over arbitrary rules, stopped by the barbecue as well. He wasn't a resident, but George had invited him as a thank you for his help. We talked for a while about the case and its aftermath. "You know, I deal with HOAs all the time in my job," Marcus said. "Most of them are fine, just regular people trying to maintain their neighborhoods. But every once in a while, You get someone like Patricia who goes on a power trip. The problem is that most people just give in rather than fight. They pay the fines, do the unnecessary work, whatever it takes to make the HOA happy, but that just enables the bad behavior. I almost gave in, I admitted. If it weren't for your report and Rebecca's legal help, I probably would have backed down. But you didn't, and look what happened. You didn't just save your insulation. You saved the whole neighborhood from a corrupt board. He was right. Though I had never set out to be any kind of hero, I had just wanted to keep my pipes from freezing. As the sun set that evening and neighbors continued to mingle and laugh, kids running around playing while adults chatted and enjoyed the warm spring weather, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt since moving to Spokane. This was what a neighborhood should feel like. Not fear and surveillance, but community and support. The legal battles were over. Patricia was in prison, paying for her crimes. The HOA was under new, reasonable management. My insulation was staying exactly where it was, keeping my home safe and comfortable. And I had made real friends among my neighbors, people who had been through the fire with me and come out stronger on the other side. I thought about that first certified letter, the one that had started all of this. At the time, it had seemed like a disaster, an arbitrary punishment for doing something sensible and safe. But in retrospect, it had been the catalyst for necessary change. If Patricia had never sent that letter, she might have continued embezzling money and terrorizing homeowners for years more. Sometimes standing your ground on a matter of principle leads to consequences you never expected. Sometimes doing the right thing, even when it's difficult and expensive, creates ripples that spread far beyond your initial intention. I had just wanted to insulate my attic. I had ended up helping to reform an entire HOA and put a criminal behind bars. As winter approached again that year, I made sure to schedule a routine inspection with Marcus to verify that my insulation was still in good condition. It was, of course. Professional installation meant it would last for decades, but I wanted the documentation, just in case. The new HOA board had no issues with it. George even asked me for Marcus's contact information, because several other homeowners in the neighborhood were interested in upgrading their own insulation after seeing how well mine worked. Some of them had been dealing with the same frozen pipe risks for years, but had been too afraid to do anything about it under Patricia's regime. I provided the information gladly, and even helped a couple of neighbors understand the permit process and what to expect during installation. It felt good to help others avoid the problems I had faced. In December, almost exactly 2 years after Patricia had been arrested, I received a letter in the mail. It was from the Washington State Department of Corrections. Patricia was requesting early release after serving 18 months of her sentence. As a victim of her crimes, I had the right to submit a statement to the parole board about whether I supported or opposed her release. I thought about it for several days. Part of me wanted to write a scathing letter opposing her release, detailing all the stress and harm she had caused. But another part of me recognized that she had served her time according to the plea deal, and holding on to anger would only hurt me, not her. I ultimately wrote a brief, factual statement. I outlined what had happened with my insulation, the harassment that followed, and my discovery of her financial crimes. I stated that I hoped she had learned from her mistakes and would not repeat this behavior in the future. I neither supported nor opposed her release, leaving that decision to the parole board. A month later, I learned that Patricia had been released on parole. She was required to complete her restitution payments and would be on supervised probation for another year. She and her ex-husband had both moved away from Spokane. I heard through George that they had relocated somewhere in Oregon, far from the neighborhood she had once controlled with an iron fist. Life continued to improve in Madison Heights. The HOA remained under good leadership, with George eventually passing the president role to Donna after serving for 3 years. She continued his policies of transparency and reasonable enforcement. The neighborhood had become known in the Spokane area as an example of how an HOA should operate, and people actually wanted to move there rather than avoiding it. My house remained comfortable and safe through every winter. The spray foam insulation that had caused so much trouble continued to do its job perfectly, keeping my pipes from freezing and my heating bills reasonable. Every time the temperature dropped below zero, and I heard the wind howling outside while sitting warm and comfortable inside, I was grateful I had fought to keep that insulation. The legal fees I had paid Rebecca were eventually worth every penny, not just because I won my case, but because of everything that followed. She had become a friend as well as my attorney, and we occasionally had lunch to catch up. She told me that my case had become something she referenced when dealing with other HOA disputes, an example of why homeowners should stand up for their rights when they know they're in the right. Looking back on the entire experience now, from that first threatening letter to the community we had built in its aftermath, I recognized how much had changed. I had changed too. I was more confident, more willing to stand up for myself, and more aware of the importance of community and mutual support. The insulation that had started it all remained hidden in my attic, doing its job without any drama or attention, which was exactly how it should be. Sometimes the most important things in life are the ones you never see, but that protect you every single day. As I write this, it's been 3 full years since Patricia sent that first letter demanding I remove my insulation. 3 years since Marcus Reeves wrote his report about the dangers of freezing pipes. 3 years since a neighborhood came together to fight corruption and abuse of power. The house I bought as a fresh start had become exactly that, but not in the way I had imagined. I had thought I was just moving to a quiet neighborhood in Spokane where I could rebuild my life after divorce. Instead, I had become part of a community that had learned to stand together, fight for what was right, and create something better from the ashes of corruption. My pipes never froze. The insulation stayed exactly where the city inspector said it needed to be. And Madison Heights became a neighborhood where people weren't afraid of their HOA, but instead saw it as a useful organization that maintained property values and community standards without tyranny or abuse. That's what victory looks like in the end. Not just winning a legal battle or seeing a criminal punished, but building something better that lasts long after the conflict is over. Every time a new family moves into our neighborhood, and I see them at a community event, relaxed and smiling without fear of arbitrary rules and vindictive enforcement, I know that standing my ground on a simple matter of attic insulation was worth every moment of stress and every dollar spent. The Madison Heights HOA saga had finally reached its conclusion, but the lessons learned and the community built would continue for years to come. And somewhere in Oregon, I hoped Patricia Henderson had learned her own lessons about power, corruption, and the consequences of both. As for me, I was just grateful to be home, warm and safe, protected by insulation that no one could ever make me remove.